Okay, my name is Daniel Schreider, and this is Barbara Root. We did our presentation on caffeine, and we titled it Caffeine Deception. This is for the substance use disorder class at Colorado Christian University. And the reason we chose that title is because caffeine is one of the most widely used psychoactive drugs in the world. And many people don't even consider it a drug because it's so commonly used. First, some of the history about caffeine. The first record of its use in tea dates back to 221 BC in China. It is believed to date back even further than that. Some believe all the way back to 2700 BC in China as well, but there's no record of that because there wasn't anything written at the time. The first cultivation of coffee in Ethiopia was reported in 650 AD. Tea plants were brought to Japan in 801 AD. Very quickly, tea ceremonies throughout history became important to many cultures. And as you'll see later in the presentation, it's mentioned how important the rituals around the drug is. And like I said, most people don't consider it a drug, but tea, coffee, energy drinks, all that use caffeine, which is indeed a drug. So the ritual around that became very culturally big in Japan, China, and Europe. Drinks containing caffeine in the early days, way back in the day, they were considered intoxicating and banned in several countries. Many of the early American colonies believed that coffee was a gateway drug, leading to other drugs like alcohol, tobacco, and opioids. They actually pointed out that they believe it was talked about much like marijuana is today. That it's a gateway drug, that if you start using marijuana, you're eventually going to move on to the heavier drugs. They thought the same thing about caffeine, and they led prohibitions against it. But as you can see, the coffee and tea generated a great deal of tax revenue. So it was actually the governments and the large industries, even back then, pushed against the people that saw this caffeine coming into their diets and said, man, this is probably not a good thing. And the governments were like, nope, it's a good thing. And we're making a ton of money off of it. So that probably explains why it's so widely used, looking at how long it's been in use in the world. In 1989, in the US, there was about 200 coffee and tea retailers. Since then, in about 2013, another census was taken. There was over 30,000 of these coffee and tea retailers in the US. Caffeinated soft drinks hit the markets in the 1800s. And as we can see today, and I've seen it in a few places when I visit home, when I actually visit my brother in Utah, they actually have, it's like a restaurant, but it's soda. Like that's all it is. They just sell soda, different flavors of soda. There isn't even food associated with it anymore. So we can see how much this has grown since the early 1800s. Energy drinks hit the markets in the 1990s and early 2000s. These had a much higher amount of caffeine, and it wasn't necessarily the amount of caffeine that was in the drinks. They were also associated with many other stimulants mixed in the drink to get a higher reaction, so that it was much more highly addictive. People were getting an increased basically high, right? And so energy drinks, being though they were more destructive, but they were quickly more addictive and much stronger than soft drinks. And today we find ourselves looking at caffeine as the most popular and widely used mood altering stimulant in the world. Products containing caffeine, there's very few that aren't. Coffee and tea are the most widely used types, as we discussed since the beginning of time, since the beginning of written word. Tea was being documented. Chocolate, it's a more mild version. And once again, it's the other things that are in chocolate that help give that stimulus effect. But it is in all chocolates and the cocoa bean. Energy drinks, with the increased use of caffeine and the other stimulants, it's become kind of the go-to. It's almost like the soda for this generation. And we can see some of the damages that that's causing, especially in the younger generation. Caffeine pills, they vary in amounts of caffeine, and they increase the chance of overdose because of the way that it's delivered. The platform that it's being delivered on is a pill form. Much more can be taken in, so they can only be 100 milligrams or 200 milligrams, but that's per pill. So someone has the ability to take in more caffeine much quicker, and they can risk caffeine overdose. So with all that being said, I'm going to pass you over to my partner, Barbara, for caffeine facts.
All righty. So some of the caffeine facts that we'll kind of take a look at is that caffeine is so commonly used throughout the world that many people don't even consider it a drug. So that's interesting. And then Chinese Emperor Qin Shi Huang placed the first recorded tax on tea in 221 BC. And Daniel had kind of given you a bit of the history aspect of that in the previous slides. Tea is the second most widely consumed beverage next to water. And then 85% of the US population consumes large amounts of caffeine daily. And that could be in the form of tea, coffee, energy drinks, like we discussed earlier. And then in the US, coffee drinkers consume approximately 20 pounds of coffee annually. In Sri Lanka, India, China, Kenya are the primary exporters of tea. And then the United Kingdom, Russia, United Arab Emirates, and the US are the primary importers of tea. Like many psychotropic drugs, caffeine consumption is heavily connected with the rituals. And I think that Daniel spoke to some of those rituals again in the slides that we just previously reviewed. And then caffeine stimulating properties inhibit the effects of the, and I'm not going to pronounce this correctly, but the enzyme in the brain. Caffeine lethality really depends on the weight and size of the person, but can be lethal starting at 10 grams to or 100 cups of coffee. So that's some fun facts. There we go. Okay. So some of the caffeine research, interesting, according to the DSM-5, problematic caffeine consumption is characterized by the least of the three following, at least three of the three following criteria. So a persistent desire of unsuccessful efforts to cut down and control caffeine use, continued caffeine use despite having the knowledge and a persistent and or reoccurrent physical and psychological problem that has likely been caused or exasperated by the caffeine. And then withdrawal is manifested by either of the following. So caffeine or closely related substances taken to relieve or avoid withdrawal symptoms. Caffeine is often taken in larger amounts or over longer periods of times than was intended to. Reoccurrent caffeine use resulting in failure to fulfill major role obligations or like with work, current work situations, home and school. And then when you speak to like just the withdrawal aspect of the caffeine, some of the withdrawal symptoms can be throbbing headaches, actually pretty severe headaches to the point a lot of times people will just rather go right back and start drinking coffee than to deal with the headaches. Trembling, jitteriness, sleepiness, fatigue, lethargy, decreased alertness and even can result into some sleep disorders. So there are really quite a few, and that's just to mention some of them. There are more adverse side effects to the withdrawals as well. Another area, multiple studies have discovered the correlation between caffeine dependency, nicotine, and alcohol abuse dependency. And with this, they kind of spoke to once you have like basically become so dependent on the caffeine, and I think that they spoke to like 500 milligrams a day really solidifies that dependency, that if you have that genetic predisposition to, you know, substance abuse or whatnot, that this really can increase that propensity to become addicted, and this can lead into nicotine and alcohol and other abuse dependency. So there is a significant correlation. By having caffeine in the brain with the, again, the adenosine, no, I'm like not saying that correctly, but basically
I think
blocks
it's
the adrenaline. Adenosine, okay.
Adenosine.
Yeah, blocked the adrenaline production increase. So as if you were sending a warning message to the body. And so the way I kind of see this is kind of like that fight, flight, and freeze, because of the rush of the adrenaline that's being kind of pushed through your body, is a way to kind of, I think, grasp an understanding there. And then it talks about 2/3 of the kids in the US reported consumption of caffeinated drinks, which is actually quite a bit. And that, you know, is anywhere from soda to the energy drinks, which we're really seeing the kids, adolescents, and even young adults really getting into the energy drinks a lot more for various different reasons. When you think about the college kiddos, I mean, they're trying to stay awake, they're cramming for exams, homework, and all of that stuff. So they really push the energy drinks for that alertness and to be able to, you know, stay awake long enough to be able to get through just their coursework. Children with lower socioeconomic status showed higher caffeine consumption and worse cognitive performances in the overall 7 measures. And this, I think, kind of touches on the education piece that we kind of were thinking about when putting this presentation together, like what would we do as far as education goes. I think, you know, really trying to educate the parents about the health effects that basically come from, you know, the consumption of caffeine and the larger consumption. And when you think about the socioeconomic status, where they're saying they show a higher caffeine consumption, a lot of that relates to, you know, just the lack of resources. So their inability to have the resources, finances, the inability to afford like the formulas and the milk and different things like that. The soda and all of that is cheap. So that's what they resort to. Caffeine affects the prefrontal cortex and the adrenal system. So basically the frontal lobe is in the brain. This area basically is the area that regulates process in terms of like attention and short-term memory. So caffeine significantly affects that. And then caffeine and coffee and caffeine are found to influence, you know, many processes in people, such as digestion, metabolism, and even vision. So it does have a pretty large extent on, you know, affects us to a large extent in all areas, areas that we didn't even really think about. All right, Daniel, I'll pass it off to you.
Okay. So there was
Or is it
incredible
mine?
amount. What's that?
No.
Oh, so we've already hit you with a lot of information. We actually found a YouTube video that is shorter and it kind of condenses down what the use of coffee and caffeine does. But I did like this quote from the book from a 58-year-old male caffeine abstainer. So he said, "I am a caffeine addict, question mark. I've gone through phases ranging from being a coffee aficionado who knew the best beans to someone who drank the awful instant crap, and finally to the cola addicted, drinking 10 cans a day. By the time energy drinks came around, I had a heart problem from my obesity and had to give it up anyway." So we can see this quote is from an individual that was heavily involved in the caffeine use. And right at the end of the quote, you can see that there was some serious negative health things that happened with him throughout his lifespan. So to that, we'll go to the video. Can you hear it, Barbara?
I cannot, no.
Equipped kitchen, an impressive downstairs suite,
With its
You got it?
stimulating effects, it's easy to understand why coffee is the second most traded commodity.
Barbara, can you hear it? Barbara,
Yeah,
can you hear the video?
I could, yes.
Okay.
On Earth after oil. For many, it keeps us awake and moving through our busy days. But how does it work? What exactly does coffee do to your brain? Whenever you're awake, a chemical called adenosine slowly accumulates in your brain, and this adenosine binds to receptors which slow down brain activity. Ultimately, the more adenosine there is, the more tired your brain feels, which makes sense as the longer you're awake, the more fatigued you become. Conversely, while you sleep, the concentration of adenosine declines, gradually promoting wakefulness. But it turns out that the caffeine in your coffee is incredibly similar to adenosine in structure. The caffeine works its way through your bloodstream and into your brain, where it starts to compete and binds with adenosine receptors. But because it's not adenosine, the sleepiness effect isn't felt. Adenosine can no longer bind, meaning its calming properties are diminished, which is great for you when you're feeling tired. However, with long-term use of caffeine, your brain responds by creating more adenosine receptors, which means more caffeine is required to elicit the same response. It also means that when you try to quit drinking coffee or miss your daily intake, you might experience some withdrawal symptoms and feel more tired than you would have before you ever drank coffee. But the caffeine doesn't stop there. It also stimulates the production of adrenaline, you know, the fight or flight hormone. This increases your heart rate, gets your blood pumping, and even opens up your airways. Furthermore, it affects dopamine levels by preventing its reabsorption in the brain, which makes you feel happy. In fact, this is the exact same thing that cocaine does, just to a lesser degree. It's a drug after all. This dopamine stimulation is also the aspect of coffee that makes it moderately addictive. So, can you drink too much coffee? It turns out there is a lethal dose of caffeine, which is somewhere around 150 milligrams of caffeine per kilogram of your body. This means if you weigh 70 kilograms, you would require 14,000 milligrams of caffeine to overdose. Put into perspective, an average cup of coffee contains roughly 150 milligrams of caffeine, meaning if you're 70 kilograms, approximately 70 cups of coffee would kill you. However, you'd have to drink those cups all at once, making it effectively impossible to overdose on caffeine from coffee, since you wouldn't be able to physically fit that much in your stomach. You would also start experiencing mania and hallucinations before getting to this point. Caffeine also has a half-life of around 6 hours, so if you drank a standard coffee with around 150 milligrams of caffeine, after about 6 hours there'll only be 75 milligrams left in your system and you'll be feeling half of the effect. And 6 hours after that, you'll have 37.5 milligrams, leaving more room for adenosine to jump back into action, which is why you may reach for another cup throughout the day to maintain that glorious, alert, and energetic feeling. So drink up and enjoy the buzz. while it lasts. And for all of you in school, while we know caffeine is key, so are good deals on textbooks. So we've teamed up with slugbooks.com to get you the cheapest prices for the books you need. All you have to do is head to slug.
Okay. Can you still see me, Barbara?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
We are not in the camera. I don't know what's going on here.
Yeah.
Okay, so we got our video back up. I thought that was a very helpful video on how caffeine consumption works with the brain and how it affects the adenosine. And we will be moving into our conclusion, and I will pass it back to Barbara to wrap up our presentation.
All righty. So in conclusion, there's a lot of things we learned today. There was a lot of information. So we just sort of broke it down into some bullet points so to kind of pull it all together. So caffeine, if used properly, does have some good health benefits. They think about cardiovascular, I think that's the one that stands out the most, is that they do say that, within moderation, it does have cardiovascular benefits, health benefits. With individuals and families, education and potential health risks associated with caffeine abuse, addiction is crucial. And so we kind of touched a little bit on that in the research area. And this is primarily where I think as parents trying to be more mindful of what our children are ingesting, trying to kind of educate them about healthy choices, just some healthy alternatives, with the understanding it's hard when kids are at school, especially the adolescents and young adults. I mean, sometimes, we have limited control there, but at least in our environment, really trying to work to educate them and providing healthy solutions to some of the sodas and coffees and teas and energy drinks that they have that bent to want to have and consume. Caffeine is so common that it is often overlooked as a psychotropic drug. Caffeine is the most widely used psychotropic drug worldwide, so globally. We can see where Daniel touched on some of that in his earlier slides. I mean, where it began from a historical level and then just where it is today. I mean, it's global. So most common forms of caffeine are coffee and tea. Caffeine use is literally a global phenomenon. Caffeine can be abused and can reach levels of toxicity. And so I think the little slide or the video clip kind of touched on some of that, kind of gave us a bit of a perspective as to what that looks like. The DSM-5 recognizes caffeine addiction as a condition for further study. So it's a continuum, something that they're following, something that they're, still furthering their research to determine, the side effects or the adverse side effects it can have. Caffeine causes more destruction in young adults and kids. We kind of touched on that. And then finally, the correlation between caffeine addiction and substance abuse has been proven as well. So thanks very much for listening. Any final words, Daniel?
Nope, that concludes our presentation on caffeine. Even though everyone gets a cup of coffee on the way to work, I think very little people view it as a psychoactive drug. Here are references that we used, including the references for all the photos used in the presentation. And that is it. So thank you.
Thanks.